on Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph. We're on page 42a, and we are meant to begin the Mishnah. We are at a new section, and this Mishnah will talk about the custom, really in the olden days, that people used to have to drink wine before a meal and drink wine after a meal, have certain smorgasbord before the meal, after the meal. There were certain traditional or customs, I should say, that were done that maybe we don't exactly do today. But the question comes up as to reciting brachas. What is exempted from a bracha because you are covered by a bracha that you already recited earlier? What needs its own bracha? And so these are some of the issues that come up in this Mishnah. Another point that comes up in this Mishnah is regarding reciting a bracha and having a lot of other people in mind. In other words, not just for yourself, but you're including others. And when is that applicable to recite a bracha for others, and so on? So here, we're going to begin the Mishnah. The Mishnah on 42a, it's all the way on the bottom. Beirach al hayayin. If a person recited the bracha on wine, shelifnei hamozin. He recited a bracha on wine that comes before the meal. So again, as I mentioned, in those days, there was a custom to drink wine before a meal, and even have some type of hors d'oeuvres before the meal. So what happens if a person recited a bracha on the wine before the meal? So it says, Patar as hayayin shala'achar hamozin. This actually exempts the wine that's going to come after the meal as well. So Rashi tells us that we're talking about before benching, that they had a custom after they finished eating, they would have wine, another wine tasting at the end of the meal. And Rashi tells us they would have the wine together with some type of a kisnei, which is what we were speaking about earlier, where Rashi held they used to have some type of a bread that they would eat it with. They would have this kisnei in lachmaniyos, and Rashi on 41b mentioned this idea when it says pasabah b'kisnin. He says after they would eat, they used to have kloyos, which is some type of grain that's roasted, and they would eat that together with pas that's kneaded with spices, uvliash, and they would put into that bread these spices and walnuts and almonds. And so Rashi here, he makes one switch. He makes one change. He says that the custom was to drink wine, and they would eat together with the wine. They would eat this kisnei, which is good for the heart, and lachmaniyos, which was both before the benching. So in other words, Rashi makes a change before he mentions that they used to have this after the benching, and that was on page 41b. And here Rashi mentions that they would have this before the benching. So it seems like, I guess, there were different times, there were different customs. Some had it before, some had it after. Sometimes you did it one way, sometimes you did it another way. So Rashi here is dealing with the fact that you're going to eat it before the benching. Is that going to be covered? Is the wine that we're talking about the wine, is the wine going to be covered with the wine you drank earlier for the wine you're going to drink later? So if we think about this more with regard to the laws of brachas, what comes out is the wine before the meal and the wine after the meal are almost like a separate entity than the meal itself. And the wine before the meal being, if you did recite a bracha on it, so the Gemara, the Mishnah's thinking maybe that bracha that you recited on wine that's not part of the meal, so to speak, you're saying a bracha on it, should that cover the other wine that's not part of the meal? Would that cover that as well? So this is like wine that's in addition to the meal. And again, if you drank wine during the meal, that's like in a different category. But here we're dealing with wine that's not part of the meal. It's before it and after it. So the Mishnah says, you bless the wine before the meal, that will exempt the wine that's after the meal. And the logic is that both of these wines fall under the same jurisdiction. They're not really part of the meal. You need to recite a bracha. One bracha covers both. That's the logic. Now, what about the other foods, the hors d'oeuvres that you're eating? So, Berach al haparperes shelifnei hamazon. If you made a bracha on the parperes, which is this dish, or Rashi's example of it, is the hargiot in dagim, which seemingly means chicken and fish. So, if you recited a bracha on these like hors d'oeuvres before the meal, this exempts the parperes after the mazon. This will exempt these hors d'oeuvres that are served after the meal. And what we're the example of that seems to be kloyos and lachmanios. Kloyos are these parched grain that's like roasted, and lachmanios seem to be these type of loaves or kichel or egg kichel or something that they would eat after they finished after the meal. So it's sort of like a dessert or some type of hors d'oeuvres. Now, you would not need to recite another bracha on them. They're exempted from the earlier hors d'oeuvres that you recited a bracha on already.
Rabbi, when did you bless for the dessert before?
So what we're referring to is if you had hors d'oeuvres before the meal.
Oh.
That's what the Gemara is mentioning. That's what the Mishnah is mentioning, that you did recite the bracha on this parperes before the mazon.
Yeah, so, but parperet you said is palgiot and dagim.
So that's a good question. That's what the commentaries are dealing with here.
That's what's throwing me off. I don't know.
That Rabbi, the bracha is a different bracha.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Would this cover the smorgasbord before, let's say, a wedding meal?
So again, the smorgasbord before the meal, we're not giving any exemption for a bracha there. There you have to recite all the brachas. The question is if it will cover the dessert or the which is after the meal. That's the issue that we're dealing with. Not if you need to recite a bracha on that on those foods, because those are before the meal. You didn't wash yet. We're talking about those type of foods. The only thing is, most places nowadays, whatever your smorgasbord is, it's not really the same as the desserts after the meal. It's really very different. Or even if just whatever you're eating before the meal, I don't know if it's similar. Here, it seems like what we're assuming is it's similar types of foods, and because of that, what the bracha you made before, somehow will exempt it. Now, the problem is it doesn't really fit with the rules. And Ben's question is a very strong question, because it shouldn't work. You say a shahakal on before the meal. How is that going to exempt the nuts or the grain, the hadama that you're going to have after the meal?
It's not a ham.
So one of the
Excuse me.
commentaries
Rabbi?
says,
Oh,
yeah, just 1 second. Let me just mute everyone here. So I'll share with you what the commentaries. Oh, somehow it's not muting. Okay. So I'll share with you what some of the commentaries are. So one of the commentaries, the Tosfos Rid, he wants to say that it actually works. Because they're both like, they're both meant for benefiting the meal. They're l'tzoirach hasu'uda. They're a part of the necessities of the meal. The one before it and the one after it. Therefore, when you recite a shahakol before, it's very inclusive and it will exempt all the different items that you're going to have as also as necessities for the meal afterwards. However, Rabbeinu Hananel and other Rishonim don't seem to agree with this. And therefore, they explain that the food before the meal is not, as we explained earlier in Rashi, that it's shahakal. Rather, they say that you're having mezainos before the meal. You're having some type of pastas and other types of foods that are mezainos. And therefore, it's not surprising that it will exempt the mezainos after the meal.
Rabbi Smith?
So that seems like it's the two ways of learning. Now,
Rabbi Smith?
yes.
When I was in Israel, I was told a number of times that the quinoa or whatever the dessert, even though we made, well, usually it was hamotzi, but even if we made shahakol before the regular meal, that we had to make a separate baracha right before the dessert, especially if it was a different food like nuts or fruits. That it was like it was a separate thing.
What do you mean? You used to have something before the meal?
No. Maybe I'm not making myself clear.
But that's not
you
what's
make
written here.
hamotzi or you make shahakol before you have your meal, but then when you have your dessert, before you eat your dessert, you have to make the baracha for the nuts or the fruit that you're eating for the dessert.
But I'm asking, what did you used to eat before the meal?
Yeah.
The regular meal would be the bread with, or even without bread, like, for example, cereal, eggs, whatever you would eat, or a fish, or even basar with vegetables and whatever else. But then the quinoa would be like fruit or nuts.
So you would recite another bracha on the dessert?
Yes, that's what I was told to do.
So, and you're not sure if it was just a bracha on dessert when you had a meal hamaitzi, or if it was a bracha after a meal without hamaitzi. You don't remember.
But open klali, that if it was whatever the regular meal was, lo mishaneh, it didn't make a difference. When we had the dessert after, we had to make a bracha on that dessert.
So what you're saying is not wrong regarding a hamaitzi meal, that you would recite a bracha on dessert. It's not really part of the hamaitzi, which is what we've been learning about before. The only exception to that point, that dessert doesn't need a bracha, would be like cake that maybe falls into the questionable category of possibly being hamaitzi. There are certain cakes that could be considered like bread, according to different opinions, and therefore you wouldn't say a bracha on it because your bread bracha might exempt it. But other than that, desserts, like for example, melon should not require would require a new bracha because it's not exempted from with the hamaitzi, because
Yes.
that's like a real dessert. Now jump back to a different case. Let's say you had a meal without bread and you ate chicken and green beans.
Yes.
And for dessert, you're having melon. So
Yes.
it would seem that the bracha you recite on the green beans would be, you would have in mind, it should exempt your melon. Like you should not be reciting a new bracha on melon for what you're eating for dessert, but rather your bracha on the green beans should exempt the melon. That's the way it should be. Maybe you didn't have the melon in front of you. You didn't know that it was there. That could be a different scenario. If it just arrived, if they just brought. But if you're eating as a guest and the host, you don't know what they're bringing. Generally, your bracha, you sort of have in mind whatever they're going to bring. Is part of your bracha. So I wouldn't think that you should be reciting another bracha ha'adama on the melon. Again, we're talking about where there was no bread and you already recited that bracha. Our Mishnah here is dealing with a different case. Our Mishnah here is dealing with a case where you're eating stuff before the meal and after the meal. So you're having like two desserts. One is the dessert before the meal and one is the dessert after the meal. Or you're having two type of appetizers, before the meal and after the meal.
Like a forspice.
Yeah, so somehow, I don't know how practical this is nowadays, because I understand they have hors d'oeuvres before a meal, but generally you're not eating the same type of stuff after the meal. You know what I mean? But and it's rare to have hors d'oeuvres before a meal, only at like weddings or bar mitzvahs.
That's right.
So it's not like very common to have this. Like at a Shabbos meal, you don't really have hors d'oeuvres before the meal, a regular Shabbos meal. So it's a but I guess the question would be, if you do have a smorgasbord before the meal, would that exempt the dessert? I guess this would be a scenario. So it might not be the same exact foods, but it could be the same brachas. Or as the Tosfos Rid wants to learn, that maybe your shahakol of the hors d'oeuvres might cover the desserts even of different brachas, because somehow both of these are necessities for the meal, for a fancy meal, and therefore it could be that it will exempt it. So I guess what Ezra mentioned, that maybe this is like the smorgasbord before the meal, maybe it will exempt the dessert. That I guess that's one way of learning this. The other way of learning it is that we're specifically talking about when it's the same bracha. So you have foods of the same bracha. This is the way Rabbeinu Hananel is learning, and that would be that it's the same in other Rishonim as well. That you're talking about it's the same bracha, and what the Gemara is really telling us is that the hamaitzi does not cover it. But if you recited a bracha beforehand, it will exempt the dessert that's the same bracha. So in other words, what is the Mishnah really telling us? According to Tosfos Rid, the Mishnah is telling us that even though it's the wrong bracha, but shahakol is a very inclusive bracha and it'll cover whatever is necessary even after the meal. According to the Rabbeinu Hananel, what the Mishnah is really telling us is that if you didn't eat hors d'oeuvres before the meal, then the hamaitzi of the meal does not cover these hors d'oeuvres that are being served at the end of the meal. It doesn't cover these appetizers. That's really what the Mishnah is saying. However, if you did recite a bracha before the meal, that will cover the appetizers that are eaten after the meal. That seems to be what according to the Rabbeinu Hananel. Okay, so
can we get back to my question, Rabbi?
So your question, we sort of answered it with the Tosfos Rid, In other words, we said there's two ways of learning it. One is that it is going to exempt foods of a different bracha, and that's a very surprising halacha, but there is such a commentary that explains it that way. Being shahakol is very inclusive. It will include other items that are tzairech hasuuda.
Yeah, but first they say that you have to bless separately on the parperet, and then they say the pat poter parperet.
And then they say what?
Pat. If you bless on the pat.
That's the next. We didn't. 1 second. Wait.
Oh, I thought
Wait for
we
the
did.
end of the Mishnah. Let's not get mixed with that. So
That's
here
what
we're
makes
just
me up
dealing.
too.
Here we're dealing with two parperases. The
Okay.
before the meal parperas and after the
And
meal.
after, yeah.
So fine. Now the Mishnah says Berach ala pas poteres parperas. That's a new case. Now we'll deal with that. So Berach ala pas, you made the bracha on bread, which includes the meal. It includes it's an inclusive bracha, as we all know, that when you make a hamaitzi, so it includes the chicken that you're going to eat in the meal. It includes the vegetables. It's a very inclusive thing. So you recited a bracha on the pas. It includes the parperis. It includes the other foods. Now, what about if you recited the bracha on other foods? Ala parperes, if you recited the bracha on the other foods, loy potar es hapas, you are not exempted from the bracha on the bread. So the bracha on the bread covers the appetizers, the other parts of the meal, but you just recited the bracha on the meal part. It doesn't exempt the bread. Now, this is a very hard statement of the Mishnah. Why would you think that if you recited the bracha on the parperes, let's say you recited a bracha on chicken, why would you think that's going to exempt the bread? Why would anyone think so? Why does the Mishnah have to say this? This is it's surprising to that the Mishnah would even say such a thing. You know, I understand it says the other way. If you recite the bracha on bread, that exempts the parperis. It exempts the green beans, the potatoes, the rice. It exempts the parperis or the condiments that you're eating with the bread. Whatever it is, it's covering the dishes of the meal. But what about you recited the bracha on the parperis? Why is that covering why would you think it would cover the bread? The Mishnah says it doesn't. Of course it doesn't.
Rabbi, can I answer your question? It may be breaded chicken. Breaded chicken, and maybe have breading on it, and may have breading inside the chicken.
Like schnitzel.
Schnitzel. Some are made with the breading inside.
So some want to say similar to what you're saying, that the Tosfos wants to explain that we're dealing with bread that was cooked in a that it could be something, you know, that has a bread, it has bread in it, a bread ingredient in it, and because of that, or it's fried bread or some other soaked bread, cooked bread, and what ends up happening is that the bracha on it is mezainos. Now, being that the bracha would be mezainos, then you might think that it might exempt the hamaitzi, because bread is also something that satiates a person. So you might say that it would be exempted, being that you recited the bracha on the main part of the meal, and the bracha that you recited was a mezainos, there might be room to say that it would exempt the hamaitzi. So that is one way of understanding it. Now, I don't want to say it's exactly what you're saying, Moshe. And the reason is because there's a lot of discussion about breaded chicken. And we brought it up before, breaded schnitzel. First of all, there is a breaded schnitzel that's made with cornflake crumbs, and that is for sure not mezainos. And then you have breaded schnitzel that's made with flour, and that is a big debate. Some want to say that it's still shahakol because the breading is so thin, it's so minimal that it's not significant enough. Nowadays, I think schnitzel maybe has a much thicker breading, most schnitzels that I'm aware of, but it could be in the past, they used to have a very thin layer of that.
Yeah, but bread costs less than meat, so
that's why they started making it thicker. Okay, that could be.
I think that's right. I think that's true. I was thinking that myself.
Yeah, well, it also tastes better. I think that's another point. People love fried foods, and the breaded part gets more fried and oily, and it actually gives it a very nice flavor. It's awful for your health, but it definitely tastes very good, and if they know how to make it right. And so it would seem to me that the bracha should change now that people do make much thicker schnitzels. The breading is much thicker. It would seem to me that the brachas should change. But if you look around in brachas books, many of them are going to say shahakol on breaded schnitzel. But it would seem to me like it should change. The bracha should change because the custom now has been to recite a mezainos on it. So your example is not a simple example, but it's not wrong. And it would seem that that's the case of the Mishnahs, where you're reciting a bracha mezainos and you might have a thought that it could exempt the bread. Yes, Ben.
Are you saying that because the schnitzel is thicker, you should say a moitzi on it?
Yeah, what I mean thicker is not that the chicken part is thick. I mean that the fact that the breading is thick. Not that you should say hamaitzi, that you should say mezainos.
Oh, mezainos, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So, and then the question would be, what after bracha to say? Because it depends how thick it is. If you have 1/6 of it is bread, and 5/6 or less than 5/6 of it is chicken, then it would definitely be an al hamichya. But if it's less than that, it would be questionable al hamichya, because there's two opinions. Do you need to have a kizayis b'chtei achilas pras, an olive size within the amount of 4 eggs or 3 eggs? There's an argument about that also. But an olive size within the amount of, let's say, 3 eggs worth, that would be 1/6. So if you have that, then it's definitely al hamichya. But if you have less than that, it would be questionable, because one opinion says it doesn't need to be 1/6 of flour versus chicken. And so it would create another issue as well as the after blessing. I'm just sharing with you so you're aware of that. But it is an argument. There is a question you enter if you if you eat, depending on how much of it you eat, if you would be able to recite an al hamichya. it might be advisable to eat something else that's mezainis, or to eat it in a meal of hamaitzi, and so on. Okay, so getting back,
Rabbi Smith.
yes.
It just occurs to me now that with all these processings and mixings that they do with these coatings, just with regard to the comment that it says shahakol on some of these breaded things, it's possible that they have so many other ingredients mixed in, not only eggs with the bread crumbs, but aside from condiments, just other things that might be like simchoni, like it might be vegetable or other mixtures within that bread mixture, so that maybe that's why they put shahakol on some of them.
Yeah, but that's not going to change. The first bracha is not changing. It's the end bracha that I shared with you that could be complicated if it's less than a sixth.
On the hamechia.
Yeah, the first bracha doesn't matter. The first bracha, it shouldn't matter. The first bracha, the fact that it has flour in it, should make it mezainis. In these rare scenarios where we exclude where we say no, it's not mezainis. One of them would be if the flour is there just to make it ladabkoi, which is to attach it to make it attached. Like, for example, it wouldn't hold if you didn't have that flour. For like licorice, they want to say maybe is shahakol, and the reason for the flour is because it won't hold. Some say licorice is shahakol because the flour is just to hold it together. I don't think so. I think licorice is also mezainis, but that would be an example of flour, the beginning bracha, an exception to the rule. But normally the rule is anything that has flour is for sure mezainis. The after bracha, that's where it gets questionable, depending on how much. But the beginning bracha is almost always mezainis. There are a few exceptions to the rule, and one of them would be if it's there just to hold the dish together. That would be an exception where the mezainis wouldn't override.
The licorice iced tea always has a lot of wheat in it.
The what? What did you say?
The licorice that I've seen.
No. So I mentioned that
a lot of wheat in it. Wheat.
Right,
Yeah,
I mentioned that it seems that that they've done research, and they found that it has a huge amount of wheat in it. The breaded, fish breaded, most rabbis consulted agree that the bracha is shahakol. One of these books says. There, however, well, anyway, so they bring that's what it seems from their rabbis that they consulted. But definitely the Art Scroll book mentions that it's not so simple, and it would seem like it might be mezainis. Okay. In any event, let me finish up over here because my time is up. So Beis Shammai says, Af loy maaseh kedera. It doesn't even cover porridge. And the question, there is a question as to what Beis Shammai means here, that it doesn't even cover porridge. Does Beis Shammai mean that if you recited a bracha on bread, the first opinion said it exempts the parperes, it exempts these other hors d'oeuvres? Does Beis Shammai say no? It doesn't cover the hors d'oeuvres, and it doesn't even cover the porridge? Or is he saying it on the bread, that if you recited the bracha on the parperes, on the dish, it doesn't cover bread, and Beis Shammai says it also doesn't cover the kedera, the porridge? So we'll see in the Gemara this question, and the Gemara is going to conclude teku, which means we don't know what the we'll wait for Eliyahu Hanavi to answer what Beis Shammai means. And then the Mishnah ends off with the other law that I mentioned, where we have people sitting together, and should one of them exempt everyone else with the bracha? So it says, Hayu yoshvin kol echad mevarich la'atzmai. If everyone's sitting together and they're not leaning, in the olden days, they used to lean when the sign that they're having an official meal is that they're all leaning, and they have a special way that they would lean and it would show this would be like an official meal, the opposite of like a fast food restaurant. Exactly the opposite. This is like a real meal is when they lean. So if they're just sitting, and the Mishnah says yoshvin, if they're sitting, they're not leaning, everyone should recite the bracha of their own because they're not really part of a group meal. So everyone should say their own bracha. Hesebu, but if they're leaning on these type of cushion beds type of thing, and that means they're having an official meal together. This is a group seating, a group sitting, a group event. Echad mevarich l'kulan, one person blesses for everyone, and one person is mitzi all the other people. And now we turn the page, we're on 42b, and it says, Balahem yayin b'seich hamazon, if they have wine in the middle of the meal, kol echad v'yechad mevarich liatzmai, everyone should recite their own bracha, even though this might be an official meal where they're leaning. Nevertheless, everyone should say their own bracha on the wine. Again, we're talking about you didn't have wine earlier, so you have to recite a bracha on wine, or that would be one of the options here, that maybe you didn't have wine before, so you need to recite a bracha on the wine. But the bracha, everyone should recite their own bracha, and the reason is because we don't want anyone choking, because we want everyone to recite. Well, we'll see in the Gemara, but everyone should recite it because not everyone's ready for it at the same time. So everyone should make their own bracha. However, achar hamazon, after the meal, in other words, after they finished the regular meal, the food part, now they're having wine. After the mazon, echad mevarich l'kul, and then one of them could exempt everyone else for the wine. Now, the Mishnah concludes and says, V'hu omer al hamugmar, and that person who says the bracha on the wine, he will say the bracha on the incense, the type of spice that they used to smell. And even though it was brought after the meal, and it's not part of the necessities of the meal, nevertheless, recite that bracha.
That's the beginning. That's a kiddush.
Nevertheless, the one person would have in mind everyone. Okay, so that concludes the Mishnah. To be continued. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rebbe. By the way,
Thank
I
you,
want
Rebbe.
you back